Your Eminences, Your Grace, Holy Fathers and Mothers, ladies and gentlemen, or as Metropolitan Kallistos would say much more concisely, friends. First of all, I must thank Archbishop Gregorios for being with us this evening and for delivering in person that warm-hearted message from Patriarch Bartholomew. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure for me, as chairman of the Friends of Mount Athos, to welcome you all to this very special occasion. Nor should I omit to welcome those who are listening and indeed watching us on YouTube and whatever other electronic medium may be available to them. Since our first conference here in 2003, we have come a long way. And now we address a potential audience of thousands. Many of them would have wished to be here in the flesh. And we were greatly distressed that we had to turn away so many applicants. But sadly, of course, the capacity of the hall and indeed of this room is limited. We therefore decided to commission Venue Audio Visual to do their best to provide a virtual experience for those whom we couldn't accommodate. Our first conference, some of you were here and will remember it, was entitled Mount Athos, the Sacred Bridge. And that was devoted to various aspects of the spirituality of the Holy Mountain. And in my capacity as a publisher, I was delighted to publish the proceedings as a printed volume. And I'm pleased to tell you that the first edition sold out and the book has had to be reprinted. But my publishing colleagues always warned me to be wary of publishing too many Festschriften. They never have a coherent theme, I was told, and they don't sell. Now, this conference is entitled Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, or in Greek, orthotomaunta ton logon tis alithaios. That's a phrase that occurs in St. Paul's second epistle to Timothy, and also, of course, in the Divine Liturgy, where it forms part of a prayer that our bishops will guide us along the correct path. First of all, remember, O Lord, our Metropolitan Kallistos, and grant that he may serve your holy church in peace, safety, honor, health, and length of days, rightly dividing the word of your truth. Now, assuming that our speakers follow the bishop's example and correctly dissect the truth, which is what the word means literally, we are hopeful that the proceedings of this conference may also in due course be published. And if they are, the subtitle is likely to be something like Studies in Honor of Metropolitan Kallistos. In other words, it will be a Festschrift, nor does it have much of a theme, unless it be the life and work of our honorand. And yet, I'm happy to tell you that I've received invitations from quite a number of highly respected publishers to submit a proposal for publication of the papers. Now, this contradicts all the advice that I was given as a publisher. And I can only conclude that it tells us something, or rather it tells us quite a lot, about the distinction of the man we are here to honor in the course of this weekend. Now, we could, of course, have chosen to devote the whole weekend to hagiography. Admirers, spiritual children, former students, academic colleagues, would still have clamoured to be here, and we would no doubt have had a thoroughly entertaining, if somewhat self-indulgent, weekend. We decided to do something slightly different, which we like to think will be more interesting. We're going to deal with the hagiography in just one session, the first one, which will follow in just a few minutes from now. The rest of the conference, or rather symposium or drinking party as we prefer to call it, the rest of the conference will address some of the areas, some of the concerns to which Metropolitan Kallistos has devoted attention in the course of his career. We shall therefore be looking with quite a broad brush at such themes as the Philokalia, and I might say we've deliberately placed that first as an indication of how eager we are for the publication of Volume 5. We shall look at monasticism, not specifically Athonite monasticism, but monasticism through the eyes of an Athonite. We shall turn to patristics, both patristic texts and the patristic element in the monastic tradition. We shall have a paper on ecumenism, and the Metropolitan himself promises a paper about his own experiences as a pilgrim on Mount Athos over the past half-century or so. So I hope I have whetted your appetite for what is to come. And the sooner I sit down, the sooner we can get on with it. All I would ask is that you try to bear in mind the fact that we are being filmed. So please try not to obstruct the line of vision from the camera. Please make sure that your mobile phones are turned off whenever you're in this room. And please keep coughs and sneezes to a minimum. So welcome. Thank you for being here. And please participate joyfully in the proceedings of this symposium. Now, let me introduce this first session. Metropolitan Kallistos is obviously a man of many parts. No doubt we could have extended the list ad infinitum, but we have narrowed it down to just six. 6 roles in which he has touched the lives of many of us, and in some of them, probably all of us. And if there's a common thread to them, I suggest to you that it will be that of a communicator. In every one of these 6 tributes, I predict that the speaker will be talking about Metropolitan Kallistos as a communicator in some form or other. Whether he's preaching or praying, writing or lecturing, he has this extraordinary gift, this talent for capturing the attention and holding it with a perfect sense of timing, so that we can hardly wait for the next word or phrase or volume, even 20 years on. It's a gift, a great gift, and I'm eager to hear from our speakers this evening how, in these various ways, he has used it. Each of these short tributes will last for a maximum of 15 minutes. And I shall be a ruthless timekeeper because it's already a long session and we want to get to the bar before it closes. There will therefore be no questions. I shall simply introduce each speaker very briefly and invite them to hold forth. So first up is Frances Jennings. Frances is a very busy lady. She keeps a maternal eye over at least 7 children. She runs one household in London and another household in Oxford. She sings in the choir of Father Stephen's Church in Oxford, and she is a high-powered accountant in the City of London, a fearless woman in what at that level I suspect is still largely a man's world. She was received into the Orthodox Church by Metropolitan Kallistos 6 years ago, and I had better declare a personal interest because she is my goddaughter-in-law, if I may use that term of my godson's wife. And her subject is Metropolitan Kallistos, the spiritual father. Frances.
Thank you very much, Gregory. I have to say that when Gregory first asked me if I would do this, my reaction was one of terror and horror combined. And I have to say that's exactly how I feel now. First of all, I think possibly you need a rather more glamorous cheerleader to get this going, and that was something that Father Stephen said, that we should come with pom-poms, as we are the start of this. I'm also the only girl speaking at this conference, and I'm also the only one who has no claim whatsoever to be a theologian. But I am one of Bishop Kallistos' spiritual children, and that is an immense privilege. I first met him, I think nearly 8 years ago, when I accompanied Simon, who at that stage was exploring whether he wanted to become Orthodox. To be frank, he was half Orthodox already and had been for some time. And I went along for the ride. I went along very defensively, wasn't very happy, I think, at that stage about Simon getting involved with this ethnic bunch of people, rather strange religion. And I listened very, very hard. And I asked quite a lot of questions. I asked stupid questions because I was very ignorant. I asked what the Jesus prayer was. And I wasn't patronized. I got a very straightforward answer. And I got a little pamphlet, and it was very helpful. And listening to him, I felt I could discern links from where I was as a high church Anglican. Obviously, going to build a life with somebody who was clearly going to be Orthodox, and us needing to be in the same church and able to worship together. And in the end, after we got married and after a few months, I cracked and I wrote to him and said, I don't really want to do this, but will you take me as a work in progress? And he wrote back to me and he said, yes, I'll do that. And he said, when you were there, when I was instructing Simon, and he used this phrase, I felt your eyes upon me, and I knew you were listening. And it is indicative of his humour and his kindly humour, which does make him a great communicator, as Graham has said, but also actually opens doors. He decided that as I'd sat there listening to him talk to Simon, that he'd take me very much as a work in progress, which I very much still am, and that I would learn on the job. I have to say, with Simon's very considerable help, and he has been an enormous help to me in my journey, but so has the bishop. I have to say, I struggled. I really did struggle. Those enormously long services in impenetrable languages, strange music that goes on forever, and you have to stand through it. And I remember drivelling on about this to the bishop. And again, with a light touch, he said, yes, I remember my mother when she became Orthodox, saying she now understood why the Orthodox pray so earnestly for those who have fallen asleep. But it does mean that you keep going, don't you, with that as a help. And eventually the power of the services strikes you and touches you, even in languages I don't understand, and I probably never will be any good at languages. He helps you to keep going. And most of us are on a spiritual journey, and for most of us, what we have to do is to keep going. I remember the first hurdle I had was what we were going to do about my name. Well, what's wrong with my name? My name is Francis. I've had it for over 50 years now. But the bishop, with great sensitivity, said, "What are you going to think, Francis, if you go up to a chalice in one of these strange Orthodox countries and you say your name is Francis and they don't have you?" Well, I'd have been pretty cross, and it would not have been helpful. So we had to decide what we were going to do about my name. There are very few married saints, and we thought of what we might do. We decided early on that probably Mary of Egypt was inappropriate on many levels. And we worked out that I'm, as you've heard, domestic. I'm very much a bossy padders. In my defense, if you do have 7 children, 2 houses, and Simon to run, and in your spare time be a partner in a firm of chartered accountants, you need to have a good handle on your task list. And the Marthas of this world get the dinner on. They get things done. They fuss on. They move things along. But they need to be reminded, and the name does remind you, that there's a point to it all. And the task list isn't the end in itself. That, I have to say, I struggle with. I thought at the time that it was my idea to choose Martha, because I always thought Martha had a really bad press. But she does. She's very effective. I now actually think it probably was the bishop's idea all along, and I didn't notice he was making that decision for me. And it's another example of his humour, but also his great perception. So what is he actually like as a spiritual father? I would say the main thing he is careful, really careful. If you're a spiritual father, you have immense power over your spiritual children. You could do immense harm, and he is very, very careful. He listens very carefully and considers things. He must have a huge range of spiritual children at all different stages in the journey. I'm still at base 1, but he must be dealing with people who are quite a lot further on than me. He's very careful. His only question ever is at the start is, what is on your heart? He's not dragging things out of you. He is creating, this is a dreadful phrase, but I'm going to use it anyway because it is how it feels. He creates a safe space for you to talk and to explore where you are and your sins and how you can do better. I think he must get awfully bored, because I quite often end up saying exactly the same thing. And most of us are creatures of habit, aren't we? And we end up in similar situations. We react in it with our weaknesses, etc. He's never fallen asleep in one of my confessions and manages not to look bored. But he does create this ability. It gives people an ability to talk. And it's very difficult making a confession. You are exposing yourself in a way that you don't really in any other forum. And it's very difficult, it's very important that that is carefully handled. And I feel it is with him. With me, a lot of it, because I really am a Martha, was to do with priorities. I used to think, I'm going to fit this Orthodox thing around my busy life. It's going to fit in with me. And it doesn't work like that. You have to put your orthodoxy in the middle and fit everything else around it. He used to say to me, when it was coming up to Lent, And he used to say, of course, in Lent, it's so much simpler. And I thought, what planet are you on? Have you any idea the diary management it takes to get the two of us to a pre-sanctified liturgies in the weekday, in Lent, and the busy time if you're a tax accountant? But actually, if you really listen, it's true. And I come away with a reinforcement of faith and an ability to keep going, which is really what I need to do. He tells me that I have to accept what can't be changed. Marthas always want to change everything. Accept what can't be changed and pray about it. Accept it. What you get is very wise, sensible advice. And you also I feel, that he takes the burden of my sins and I come away lighter. And somebody who said this, not me, but one of his other spiritual children, once said to me, I come away and I feel 10 kilos lighter. That's quite something, but that means all that sin is going somewhere, and basically he's carrying it. That's an enormous thing to do. And I know that you're all saying you're cross with him because he hasn't done the Philokalia. But you know, when it comes down to it, one of the reasons he hasn't done that is because he's been incredibly available to people like me and has helped us along our road. Looking around this room, there are loads of people in this room that he has helped in that way. And of course, if he helps us along, then we can help other people. That's a very, very powerful thing. And most of us, of course, are not theologians. And while I may be in the minority here, out there in the world, I'm in the majority. I'm not a theologian. And he can reach me, and I think because he has an ability to listen to people like me, whittling along, I think that impacts on the way that he writes. Because he's one of the few theologians whose books I read that I actually understand. And I think it's all part of a piece. And I think that availability and that ability as a pastor is immensely strong. And while we'll hear lots of erudite stuff about what a wonderful scholar he is, etc., this is a very important foundation and building block, and should not, in my view, as a non-theologian, be underestimated.
Thank you very much, Francis. Next is Marcus Plested. Marcus is a professor of theology at the University of Marquette in the United States. Before that, he was vice principal and academic director of the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies here in Cambridge. And before that, he was a doctoral student, writing a thesis on patristics at Oxford under the supervision of Metropolitan Kallistos. And like me, he was received into the Orthodox Church on the Holy Mountain. His subject is Metropolitan Kallistos, the teacher.
Just when Francis was speaking, I was wondering what a world that was composed largely of theologians would look like.
No comment.
No. Your Eminences, fathers, friends, it's an enormous delight for me to be able to pay tribute to Metropolitan Kallistos as teacher. I have sat at the feet of our bishop for many years now, initially as a catechumen almost 25 years ago, then as a student in Oxford, his doctoral student, and during all my time at the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge, we had the honour of having Metropolitan Kallistos 2 or 3 times a year sometimes. So I've been to very many of his lectures and heard many, but probably not all, of his jokes. In fact, I sometimes find myself starting to laugh as soon as the joke begins, because I can remember where it's going. Who can forget the tale about Calvados on the... You remember this one? I'm not going to try and repeat them myself. Or the Spanish aristocrat on his deathbed. You must forgive your enemies, says his father confessor. I have no enemies. I have shot them all. But I won't repeat too many of his jokes in your presence. In fact, I was giving some lectures once at which Metropolitan Kallistos was present, and I had to specify that my lectures would be rather shorter on this occasion because I couldn't plagiarize his jokes in front of him. Yes, I remember particularly his lectures in my student days, the way in which the humour would punctuate the lectures, but always with a point, always to refocus attention. And I must say, you never come away from one of Metropolitan Kallistos' lectures without a sense of uplift, a sense of encouragement, and also a sense of clarity. I mean, at least for a while at least, it all makes sense. I know Metropolitan Kallistos puts down his instinct for clarity to his classical education, which of course is not something that's so widely shared these days. Another thing I've always noticed in Metropolitan Kallistos' teaching is his quality of nuance. He's never been one for simple dichotomies. I can remember a tutorial with him about the complexities of the Palamite controversy, how people on both sides of this debate over the distinction between the divine essence and the divine energies. Some would be in favour of the union with Rome, some against it. And that certainly planted a seed in my mind, which has had a great impact on my recent work on the Orthodox reception of Aquinas. But yes, overall, I think you can sum up what one gets from his teaching as affirmation. It's a great yes. And as I say, a great quality of nuance. Metropolitan Kallistos has the ability to deal with the most profound matters with essential simplicity and accessibility. And I think that's a rare skill. I mean, we who are involved in academic theology are often better at making things more complicated than they ought to be rather than the reverse. I remember a story of someone hearing a very erudite story about the divine simplicity, the oneness of God, and going away saying, well, if that's divine simplicity, I wonder what divine complexity is like. Now, I can also remember that as a student in Oxford, Bishop Kallistos had a certain cult following amongst the students. People would flock to his lectures, even if they weren't doing theology. I read modern history to start with, and I used to go to his theology lectures in my last year as an undergraduate. I think some of us used to refer to him as Super K. I don't know if you ever heard that designation. Of course, Special K didn't work because of confusion with the breakfast cereal. But, as my doctoral supervisor, I perhaps saw him less often than's more the case these days, perhaps once a term when I'd written something. But I always came away with a great sense of purpose and clarity and a sense that it was all going somewhere, which is something that as a graduate student you can sometimes lose sight of, your aim, your direction. And he was a meticulous supervisor. I can remember getting back the draft of my doctoral thesis with comments on every page, correcting my Greek accents quite often. Yes, those were in the days when you could still write by hand, and I wrote it all out by hand, and Bishop Kallistos was kind enough to decipher my handwriting, which is not so easy. And there's something of a link between my piece and Francis' piece. If you think of Bishop Kallistos' lectures and also his sermons, I think it's fair to say that the sermons partake of some of the quality of his lectures partake of some of the quality of his sermons. There's a kind of union of head and heart there. I think Bishop Kallistos is an example of somebody who is able in his scholarship to unite head and heart. And I, for one, are deeply grateful for being able to experience that example at first hand for a number of years. Something else Francis alluded to is the element of sacrifice. In Metropolitan Kallistos' teaching, he has borne an immense teaching load at Oxford. He preaches, lectures all over the world, and that takes time and that takes energy, and I think we must acknowledge the sacrificial nature of Metropolitan Kallistos' devotion to teaching these many years. I can never see the name Kallistos in any context. I mean, in the Byzantine period, there are a number of Kallistoi, Kallistos Xanthopoulos, Kallistos Telekouthis, Kallistos Kataphygiotis. But I can never help myself thinking of our Kallistos. I think our Kallistos has become a sort of hapax phenomenon, a singular, unique, unrepeatable, inimitable event. And I think I might just bring this to a conclusion by bringing up a Greek expression, onoma ke pragma, something by name, something by nature. And this is a man whose teaching has indeed been consistently most good and most beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Father Ephraim Lash is an Athonite monk and himself a renowned translator and writer. He translated into English most of the services and prayers that are used in Orthodox churches and Orthodox homes in this country today. I think I first encountered him at the Spring Symposium of Byzantine Studies in Birmingham in 1994, where he gave a wonderful presentation entitled Athos as a Working Community. If I may, I would like to repeat one of the many stories he told in the course of that presentation about a monk visiting from another monastery who came to work on a manuscript in the library. And when he left, the visitor told the abbot how much he had enjoyed his meals and how tasty they had been. All we ever seem to get, he said, is boiled spaghetti. That, replied the abbot, is because you all sit in your cells all day writing books, and the poor cook gets no help. Here I expect the brothers to help the cook when they can. Father Ephraim's subject is Metropolitan Kallistos, the translator and writer.
Thank you, Graham. Elders, teachers and friends. That we can translate back into, I'll come to that in the end. No. I want just to make one observation before I start, that I object to the translation in the title of the meeting. Orthotomunton does not mean dividing. That crept into English with Tyndale, who I think got it from Luther, who uses the word Tyler. It is a word, in fact, that occurs nowhere in Greek until the translation of the Hebrew book of Proverbs. That is the first time it occurs anywhere in Greek. It is not a normal Greek word, but I'll discuss that with anybody who wants to object afterwards. I was sitting one afternoon in the Porter's Lodge in Dockyaroo, and two middle-aged Englishmen turned up. There were two doctors from Bristol, one a consultant, one a GP, and as they sat in the corner, while I was preparing what the Greeks always call, propriety, pouine tokeras mamas, they expect, as of right, to have their little coffee and particularly lethal alcohol, because we distilled it ourselves, and it was very, very dangerous. And I saw them looking at me. And in the end, being English, they wouldn't ask a direct question. So one of them said, Father, were you born in Bath? To which I was able to reply, I am not Bishop Kallistos. Because I knew that he was born in Bath, because his mother happened to be in Bath at the time, and a more suitable place for him to be born, the city of Aquaisulis, of Jane Austen, of the Pamprum, particularly for someone whose school chapel was Westminster Abbey. And that was when I knew, of course, that he had written The Orthodox Way. And that is a remarkable book. It is still in print after half a century and more, reprinted, and it is quite the clearest and best introduction to the Orthodox Church that I think we have in English. And it is not full of there's a certain type of Anglo-Saxon orthodoxy which gets a bit screechy about things. But this is a very balanced, serious account. And but while I'm on the Orthodox Church, I'd just like to remember his mother. His mother was a great character, and so was his father. In fact, his father and my father both sat at the feet of Colonel Bernard Law Montgomery at the Staff College. And my father said you could follow Montgomery's campaigns from your lecture notes. But his mother was a remarkable lady. Once I arrived at the back door wearing, I was from Mount Athos, the standard Orthodox Athonite scufo. And she would greet, she always used to use my family name. Christopher, come in. And she looked and she said, Timothy, why don't you get a fetching little felt number like Father Ephraim? He at the time had a rather splendid sort of purple Russian sort of Beretta thing, but it had seen its best days. But I have never thought of an Athonite scufo now as a fetching little felt number. And when Metropolitan Kallistos, his father, died, he was a faithful and devout Anglican. His mother decided that she would become Orthodox. And she said, nothing to do with, it's my decision entirely, nobody else has influenced this. And then she said, because I had a problem, she said, because I have to make my confession before and when you're my age, it's quite a lot. And I see far too much of you lot in Oxford. So I've decided I will wait till we go to Iona, and I will go and be received by Father John in Edinburgh, which is what she did. Now, next to the Orthodox Church, I think one of the best things that he has ever done is the Orthodox Way, which was a sort of adult catechism. And it is extremely clear. The basics of the Orthodox faith are set out in very clear and precise and simple language, and each chapter ends with an anthology, a sort of commonplace book of quotations from spiritual writers, mostly Orthodox, but all sorts of other people find their place. There's an ecumenical broadness in the... And if you want to have a commonplace book before you start making your own of quotations which can inspire your prayer and read the Orthodox Way and collect the quotations at the end. And all of them, he is a scholar, all of them are listed in the back with the full references to where you can find the original text. Now, other than those two books, there are, of course, the translations. And first of all, the translations of the Festal Maneon and the Lenten Triodion. But I would like to read you a passage. One of my favorite writers is John King, who was in the late 18th century chaplain to the English in St. Petersburg. And he wrote a marvelous book called Rites and Ceremonies of the Greek Church in Russia. And this is what he says of the liturgical texts. If I were to pass judgment on the compositions themselves, I should venture to say that for the most part they are a sort of rhapsody and bombast, difficult to be imitated, scarcely possible to be reduced to common sense. And this is generally allowed even by those who esteem some of them as ancient and sublime. to be the character of the most modern ones, for they are undoubtedly of different dates. The metaphors of these hymns are frequently so bold that they will not bear to be exhibited in our northern tongue. But listen, the reader therefore must expect to find the translations in the following pages greatly inferior to the originals. Now, but I think any of us who know the originals and the translations in the Festlumenel and the Lenten Theologian will not always find that the translations are inferior to the originals. They are not easy to translate, as I know, but Metropolitan Kallistos has a gift for putting into straightforward but rhythmical and beautiful English the original Greek. He didn't translate the Pentecostarion, but I do not think that he would ever have translated the 4 simple Greek words, defte poma piomen kenon, come, let us drink a new drink. As one English translation manages to render 4 simple Greek words as, come, let us quaff a beverage new. That is not how Bishop Metropolitan Kallistos translates. He translates the text, even if the text is simple. No, I think the Americans are doing extraordinary things with our text. Because they think that if the Troparion starts with soson, then you must start it in Greek. So they translate the Troparion of the cross, save, Lord, your people, as opposed to what any civilized person would say, Lord, save your people, which is what Metropolitan Kallistos. Can you imagine singing God Save the Queen in an American translation? Save God, our gracious Queen. It doesn't work. But I mustn't divert for too long on these things. Now, of course, I occasionally have quibbles. I object to the introduction of ands into the Trisagion. Holy God, holy strong, holy immortal. Because in the Orthodox liturgical tradition, it is Trinitarian, not addressed to one person. And there are no ands in the Greek. And this has crept in. And I must say, I have to slightly take issue with that. We don't agree entirely about the Our Father. I was very struck the other morning, the ex-canon of St. Paul's, what's his name? Canon. He was doing thoughts for the day. Giles, that's right. He was doing thought for the day, and he actually devoted it to the correct translation of the Our Father, which says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And once I was discussing this with Costa Carras, he said, yes, but Father, you see, it's the difference between the English and the Greeks. We're interested in business and money, you're interested in property rights. But I did point out, I pointed out to the international English language, that the only phrase in the Lord's Prayer which our Lord gives us his own explanation of is that phrase, the parable of the unforgiving servant. So he actually has his commentary. Anyway, that's not our business tonight. Now, those are and also those 2 volumes of translation give more than the translation. They give magnificent introductions to the services, to how they work, to the plan of them. I mean, it is an initiation into the Orthodox services of the great feasts. And you will understand more if you read, and about what Lent means, what fasting means. They are not simply translations of the text. They are an explanation. They are something that you can feed on for your understanding of what is happening in the great services. And then there is the Philokalia. And this, of course, you will notice, by the way, that Metropolitan Kallistos translations are all cooperative efforts. He doesn't live on his own in his private corner. He has helpers and assistants, and they all contribute. And all his fellow contributors, the fellow colleagues, I think, are dead. But it is the one book which I wonder what he made of it. We once presented to the Lord High Admiral, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, the first 4 volumes of the Philokalia in the English translation. I wonder where it is now in Buckhouse. 2 minutes, right. Well, oh dear, hang on. Well, I just wanted to say a word about the Philokalia, and here it's worthy of Gibbon. Worthy of Gibbon. Richard King on this. The notion of making the height of virtue and the perfection of human nature to consist in solitude and contemplation is the most extravagant of all the unreasonable doctrines fanaticism and ignorance have ever conceived. The doctrine that the most absurd in speculation and the production of the greatest evils in practice, subversive of every relative duty, destructive to human society, and contradiction to the first great law of God. That is him on the monastic life. But he does translate the whole thing. Now, what I will say, I found a bibliography of Metropolitan Kallistos on the internet, and it is a remarkable thing. There are 10 whole pages, small print. He has covered almost every topic, usually in short and understandable articles. Women priests, ecumenism, hesychasm, the Jesus prayer. It's all there in clear, simple, and understandable language. And so I will just end with a little final. We both know a young priest. He's not in England, he's not English. And I said one day to Bishop Kallistos, he's one of my Tiggers, meaning young people who need a bit of unbouncing. You remember the unbouncing of Tigger. And the familiar voice at the other end of the phone, Father Ephraim, do you not find that at our age, Tigger's bounce is not what it was? And so I'm not going to say anything in Greek or Slavonic. I'm going to wish him many years of bounce for the future.
Thank you very much, Father Ephraim. Father Stephen Platt served for many years as a priest of the Russian parish that coexisted with the Greek parish in Canterbury Road, Oxford, and formed part of the pan-Orthodox parish founded by Metropolitan Kallistos and others in the early 1970s. A few years ago, Father Stephen established a new parish in Oxford under the Moscow Patriarchate. He's also General Secretary of the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius, and his subject is Metropolitan Kallistos, the pastor and bishop.
Holy Fathers and friends, it's perhaps not coincidental that several of the speakers this evening have included material about Bishop Kallistos' mother. And I must add to this material. I first met Metropolitan Kallistos when I was a schoolboy. I was 15, and my English teacher had spent time in Oxford as a visiting scholar under the schoolmaster fellowship program, and had found herself working at Pembroke College and getting to know Dr. Ware. I was very excited at this news because he was a name known to me through reading his books. And I asked my English teacher whether it might be possible for me to visit her and we could go together to visit Bishop Kallistos, and she arranged this. And from Pembroke College we made the long walk up the Banbury Road to Staverton Road, where we were met and shown into the study. And the bishop sat us down and asked us if we would like any tea or coffee, and we both indicated that we would like coffee, at which point a rather older lady came into the room, and he looked up at her and said, "2 coffees, please." "Very good," she said, and went off. And we continued our conversation, and then after a while she came in, the same lady with the tray, the lady that we had assumed to be the housekeeper, and put down the coffee on the table, and he looked at her and said, "Thank you very much, that will be all." And she looked with a rather knowing look and said, "Very good," and walked out of the room. And it was some years later, when I came to be one of his students, that I realized that this same lady was in fact his mother. She showed me into the house again as a student and said, "Well," and on that rare occasion I was early and my teacher was late. She said to me, "Well, you're here, but where's the bishop?" "I don't know where he gets to these days. The only one of my children to remain a Christian, and he turned Orthodox, you know." Some years after these incidents, having been taught by the Metropolitan and having been grateful for his pastoral ministry, I discovered myself going to ask him for his advice, his good word, on the eve of my ordination as a priest. I thought, what better than to go and ask for the spiritual counsel of somebody who was not only my pastor but also my teacher. And he gave me 2 pieces of advice. First of all, he said, as a priest, never go out looking for things to do. God will send you exactly what you need to do. Simply be prepared to respond to God's will for you. It was good advice. The second piece of advice he gave me was also good and has proved to work to a great truth. Never forget what you are and never try to be anything other than English. Strangely enough, when Bishop Kallistos told me the advice that he had been given by a hierarch on the eve of his episcopal consecration, it was rather more down to earth. Always fold up your own vestments at the end of the service. Bishop Kallistos has now, for several generations, proved to be a pastor and a model of what it is to be an Orthodox pastor, especially to those clergy on whom he has had an effect. We have all learned from him, and to a great extent, perhaps, well, no, I'm not afraid to say, to a great extent, many of us imitate him. This is obvious when one notices somebody stand up at a podium and give a talk. Some people manage to imitate him with greater effect than others, but always with a great deal, I believe, of sincerity and of love. Some impersonations of Bishop Kallistos are unconscious and not very effective. Perhaps the worst impersonation of Bishop Kallistos I ever heard was that made by the late Milica Zernov, who attempted to impersonate Bishop Kallistos' Queen's English with her own Russian accent. However, this ineffective rendition was only matched in its ineffectiveness when I once heard Bishop Kallistos trying to impersonate Milica Zernov. Which was equally inefficient, but equally well meant and affectionate. The great Russian priest and theologian of the emigration, Archpriest Sergei Bulgakov, in a prayer written for the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius, and in a prayer which has been used for many decades by the Metropolitan, prays and asks God for certain gifts in the context of a hope for restored unity between the divided Christians of East and West. He asks the Lord to give a spirit of wisdom and of faith, of daring and of patience, of humility and of firmness, of love and of repentance. Dichotomies. And whether by accident or by design, it occurs to me that our dear teacher and pastor has, through his many years not only of teaching but also of pastoral service and example, lived true to the hopes expressed in Father Bulgakov's prayer. Bishop Kallistos is, in many ways, a man, a spiritual father, a teacher, and a priest of contrasts, of unity in diversity, which is in itself a wonderful thing if one considers this as a one-man Saburnist, a one-man reflection of what he aspires to in his faith in the Holy Trinity. Wisdom and faith. Rare it is that somebody can combine academic scholarship and the expanded academic mind with the heart of faith, which is still able to stand Sunday by Sunday, liturgy by liturgy, in front of the holy table of oblation, and with all simplicity and sincerity look towards the immanent yet transcendent God. Of daring and of patience. Rare indeed it is to find a pastor who is prepared never to give up on his spiritual children, and yet to be prepared to be outspoken and to suggest things which would put him on the line of criticism and of censure. I remember once, Bishop Kallistos, you telling me that on a trip to Athens you had seen on the front page of the conservative Greek press church newspaper, Orthodoxos Typos, bishop accused of heresy. And you said, and then I read and discovered it was in fact me they were talking about. Of humility and firmness. There is in Bishop Kallistos, as a pastor and as a teacher for priests, above everything else, a deep kindness, a humanity, an approachability. And yet, at the same time, he is not afraid to point out when something is not right. Many have been the occasions when people have caused problems in church life, have said things that should not be said, have behaved in ways which were unworthy. And he, with humility and firmness, has stood and spoken the truth in love and put people into their place without any hint of personal animosity or of hatred. A rare gift for a pastor, and a rare gift that many of us priests can learn from. Of love and of repentance. Well, perhaps it doesn't need any more to be said about these things other than that in all of our individual relationships with him, a spirit of love and of calling us to repentance has characterized them. This week, the church has been commemorating amongst the other saints a great missionary bishop of the early Western Church, St. Ansgar, the Archbishop of Hamburg, who was one of the first great missionaries to Denmark and Sweden. And a few of St. Ansgar's sayings are recorded. And one of them speaks very pertinently in the context of this evening's meeting. St. Ansgar writes, "If I were worthy of such a favour from my God, I would ask that he grant me this one miracle, that by his grace he would make of me a good man." Whether as a teacher or a pastor or a spiritual father, leaving aside the whole question of his academic work, I think that those of us who have been influenced or have learned from the Metropolitan will see an answer to St. Ansgar's prayer, that God has made him a good man, and for that we are thankful.
Thank you, Father Stephen. Father Andrew Louth is a theologian of international renown and was until recently Professor of Patristic and Byzantine Studies in the University of Durham. Before that, he taught for a decade at Goldsmiths, University of London. And before that, he was Fellow and Chaplain of Worcester College, Oxford, where one of his pupils was our Treasurer, Simon Jennings. He is a priest of the Russian Orthodox Diocese of Suroz, and his subject is Metropolitan Kallistos, the theologian.
In some ways, I think I've drawn the short straw, because Bishop Kallistos can't really be divided up into little categories. Spiritual father, pastor, whatever. All of these go together. And if we're talking about it as a theologian, we have to realize that this means that he is a theologian who speaks of God to everybody, in all sorts of ways, all sorts of different ways. Perhaps Graham meant academic. But even that, I think, would be difficult because Bishop Kallistos is a very distinguished academic. For more than 40 years, I think, held a post at Oxford University. Has written many, many articles of great learning. But just to take it to that level would be to miss, I think, to me, almost everything that it was about. And I want to just make 3 points, because we're all tired now, because everything is running late. Just 3 points. The first is that, in a way, I think you may be surprised to hear this, Bishop Kallistos is a very modern academic theologian. Those of you who hear academic gossip, sort of listen to academics sort of talking among themselves, moaning as they usually are, will have heard over the last few years a lot of moaning about impact. Yes. The last research assessment exercise, one section that everybody had to sort of do something about was impact. Not just how good the stuff was, how much the stuff was, but what impact it made. Now, I first met Bishop Kallistos in 1962, December 1962. I was in my first year at Cambridge as a young and very green mathematician. I went along to a study day that was organised by, I think, Little St Mary's. That was where it was, at any rate. Addressed by 2 people, Timothy Ware and Nicholas Zernoff. And I have very vivid memories of Timothy Ware, which actually came back to me again today. I was in Blackwell's this morning, and I noticed a pile of books on the young Eliot, with a picture of the young Eliot. I thought Bishop Kallistos was Timothy Ware, looked very like that, though his hair was not quite so uncontrollable. But the next year, a book was published called The Orthodox Church. Now, that book must have had more impact than almost anything that has been published in a theological vein for half a century or more. If you remember, I suppose you're about my age and can remember when it came out. It came out as one of a series. There was a book on Roman Catholicism. There was a book on Methodism. There was a book on Anglicanism. There's a book on mysticism. There's a book on Buddhism, all in the Pelican series. Now, virtually all of these, certainly all the Christian ones, are long dead and forgotten. But the Orthodox Church is still in print, and is still, by general repute, the best introduction to orthodoxy. That's 50 years ago. The reprints have changed it, but very, very slightly. This is a quite amazing work, and its impact has been huge. So had Bishop Kallistos been in the latest REF, unfortunately they wouldn't have allowed to talk about the impact of something published 50 years ago. But nonetheless, the impact of that is like nothing else that we could come across. So he's a very modern theologian. He has an impact that we're meant to have nowadays, and has been doing this for a long time. The second point I make is rather different. Today we kept the feast of St. Photius of Constantinople. And I remember in his book called The Library, the Bibliotheca, Miriam Vivion, when he's talking about Chrysostom, he remarks that Chrysostom never allowed his enormous capacity for rhetorical display to disguise the simplicity of what he wanted to say. Everything that Chrysostom said was absolutely clear. He had wonderful, wonderful rhetorical ability, but he never displayed it for its own sake. He simply expressed things with enormous clarity. Now, this seems to me to be something that is absolutely true of Metropolitan Kallistos. It's already been said, but then almost everything I've said has already been said by somebody because it's got somewhere else. But Bishop Kallistos has written 3 books, The Orthodox Church, a wonderful book, Efstratios Argenti, which when it came out was quite remarkable. 1964 when it came out, I think there was nothing available in English on theology in the period of the Tokokratia. It was a couple of years later that Sir Stephen Runciman gave the Birkbeck lectures, which came out eventually as whatever it's called. What is it called? The Church and Captivity, the Great Church in Captivity, which is become the kind of standard basic work on this. I mean, Bishop Kallistos' work was more focused, and also, I think I'm right in saying that the first edition was destroyed in a fire, and it became very difficult to get hold of. But it is an amazing work for its clarity. The discussions in the 18th century between Catholics and Orthodox were very complicated. And if you read Bishop Kallistos, you begin to see what it's all about in a quite astonishing way. But that's true of his articles. There are dozens of articles. I mean, when he did his Festschrift, 10 years ago, I ended up having to produce the bibliography, or do something with an already existing bibliography. And it just seemed to be endless articles all over the place in sort of strange areas. But the one thing about all these articles is they are all absolutely clear. However complex the subject is, they are utterly clear. Anybody could read them. Not because they are oversimplifying, that's not at all the case. They are simple because the fundamental issues of anything can be reduced to simple things. And it takes a great scholar, I think, a very great scholar, to be able to see the simplicities that lie behind the complexities of the commentators. And this Bishop Kallistos always does. My third point is, again, already been made. but I think it's important to make it. Bishop Kallistos, as a theologian, I think could be described in a way that I think almost nobody else could be described, that I can think of in the last century or so, as a philocalic theologian. It seems to me that Bishop Kallistos' commitment to the philokalia has not just been a matter of being behind a translation into English, which is, apart from not being complete, distinguished, concerned to make a kind of bridge between the basically classical language, particularly psychological language, that the fathers used, and the world of today. I mean, the glossary is tremendously important. The glossary enables you to sort of make some sort of movement from the technical language the fathers used, which belonged to one kind of world, and the sort of way we talk about things nowadays. But it's not just a question of translation. The philokalia, seems to me, gives a vision of theology that is very, very different from the way theology has come to be in the West. Theology in the West, I don't know, let's just leave it like that, not say from when and who and all that. But theology in the West has tended to become speculative, tend to become a matter of concepts. Now, Bishop Kallistos has stood against this, not in a, how can I put it, not in an aggressive way, but simply by doing something different, doing something that grows out of the way in which the writers of the Philokalia understood what it meant to come to know God. In one of the letters that Palamas, St. Gregory Palamas, wrote to Valam, he says, "It is very dangerous to talk about God if you don't know how to talk to him." And that seems to me to be a very fundamental insight that lies behind the Philokalia. God is not a concept. He is not an idea that we shift around, not something that we put in our intellectual space. God is one whom we approach in prayer. And it seems to me that Bishop Kallistos is a theologian who never allows us to forget this. That God, apophatic theology doesn't mean some sort of theory about negation being more important in relation to God than affirmation. Apophatic theology means that God is beyond anything we can conceive. And he's beyond anything we can conceive because he is the one that we need to come to know. And he's beyond anything that we can know. And it seems to me that Bishop Kallistos' theology, Bishop Kallistos as a theologian, exemplifies this, not just in what he writes, but in sort of who he is. Bishop Kallistos and I were colleagues together, for about 15 years. I mean, I left before he did and arrived after he did. But we were colleagues in Oxford for about 15 years. And one of the things that struck me about the way people talked about Bishop Kallistos, this is perhaps going back to him as a teacher, but he was a theologian. One of the things that struck me about the way people talked about him was that they didn't go to him just to find out about things. They found that when they listened to him, they had been drawn into an experience, drawn into a quest that they would have to pursue in their own way. But it was far more than chunks of information that was all too often the case in the lectures that I heard being given in Oxford in the 70s and early 80s. And so, I finished, it's okay. 2 minutes, but I finished. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Andrew. And our last speaker, Father Nikolai Sakharov, is a monk of the monastery of St. John the Baptist at Tolleson Knights in Essex. He is also the great-nephew of that monastery's founder, Archimandrite Sophrony. And he is the author of a book entitled I Love, Therefore I Am, which, in the words of Father Andrew Louth, traces a compelling picture of Father Sophrony's theology, no academic theory, but both the fruit of and the inspiration for his spiritual counseling. His subject is Metropolitan Kallistos the monk.
Dear Vladika, when I was invited to give this presentation, I found myself in a quandary. How much do we actually know about the monastic side of his life? We know him as a supreme theologian and coining lecturer, outstanding hierarch of the Orthodox Church, and so on. All these seem to eclipse in our minds his identity as a monk. When I asked the people who are close to him to share their views on Bishop Kallistos' monasticism, I was met with bewilderment on people's faces. Eventually, I decided to confront Vladika myself, to interview him on the subject, and he shared with me these valuable insights into his monastic career. His interest in monastic life first arose when he was still an Anglican, and he was attracted to the idea of becoming a Franciscan. But later on, he began to realize that his calling was to become Orthodox. It didn't change his desire to dedicate his life to Christ in the monastic way. He was very much attracted by the idea of community life in mutual love, as well as in services. In the early 60s, he received a letter from Metropolitan Vitali in Canada, encouraging him to visit his newly established monastery in Canada. His first Orthodox monastic experience lasted for 6 months. But soon it became clear for him and for Metropolitan Vitali that this was not the right place for him to be. It was not the most encouraging start to a monastic career. Back in England, it was Archbishop Athenagoras who encouraged Vladika to become first a deacon and then to live in the monastery on Patmos. In 1965, Vladika spent 10 months there, having meanwhile been ordained to the priesthood by Athenagoras. Then he received an invitation to come to Oxford to lecture and to take on the position of Spodling lecturer. But before he left Patmos, there was an interesting convergence. One day he went down to see the Yerunda of the island, famous Father Amphilochius Macris. He's very well known as spiritual father. The letter blessed him to take monastic vows, and he said, even if you are not going to live in the monastic community, you should still be a member of a monastic family. So, but on the other hand, when he returned to the monastery, the monk said, there is a letter for you from England. The letter was signed by Archbishop Athenagoras. And it said quite independently and simultaneously, it would be a good idea if you were to ask the abbot to profess you as a monk before you return to England. So there are these two important voices coincided in the most remarkable way, quite independently. And all the monks on Patmos agreed to accept Bishop Kallistos as a member of their community, and they tortured him a monk of a little habit straight away. Back in England, he now took up his double duties as teacher and parish priest. But as we know, Vladika has kept his closest links with Patmos ever since. It is not simply a formal connection with the monastery. He goes home every year, spends considerable time at his monastery. This is a short outline of monastic story as the Metropolitan himself shared with me. He humbly ascribes to himself a vocation that in the 19th century Russia was called learned monasticism, that combines monastic life with teaching, a vocation of being a monk in the world. However, there is much more to his vocation than appears at first sight. And I would like to share now with you my personal impression of the monk in the Metropolitan. What is it that betrays him as a monk? Perhaps can we have a picture? I remember how in one of the glorious afternoons of the Trinity term in Oxford, Metropolitan Hilarion and I invited Bishop Kallistos to join us punting on the Oxford canals. Burdened by the weight of this tremendous responsibility for such an enterprise and out of safety concerns, I asked the Metropolitan, "Vladika, can you swim?" And he replied, "Yes, if necessary." We had a truly remarkable time, splendid time with Vladika, as you can imagine. And afterwards, Metropolitan Hilarion said to me, "Amazing. Whatever Vladika does, he gives himself fully to it. He knows how to work, he knows how to rest." And now, indeed, in the case of Bishop Kallistos, I have noticed this remarkable trait to do things properly. And this reminds me of a line in a remarkable book by Bill Bryson called Notes from a Small Island, where he writes, "If the British were to do communism, they would do it properly." Vladika was a proper student, he's a proper lecturer, a proper theologian, a proper bishop, who serves the divine liturgy properly, a proper friend, a proper spiritual guide and father for many of us. He also taught us by his example how to enjoy the gifts of life properly. Above all, he is a proper Christian, and I might add that for me and for us, he is a proper monk. His monastic way is a remarkable example. It shows that if you really blend in with the divine providence, God will grant you your unique place, unique ministry, unique name, which would express your personality in the most articulate way. And as far as I can see, monasticism is an integral and imprescriptible part of His Eminence's identity. Orthodox monasticism doesn't have orders, as found in the Western tradition. Thanks be to God, it is rather disorderly. In the sense that God allows each person to find his unique way, his unique ministry to God and to the world. It is common among the Holy Fathers to see in monasticism a form of martyrdom. In the Greek language, the word martyria, martyrdom, has a double meaning. A sacrifice for the sake of God and also bearing a witness of God. In the instance of His Eminence, these two aspects of monastic martyrdom, sacrifice and witness, have become an harmonious one. I have asked Vladika how, as an Englishman, it would have felt to be a monk in his native environment, behind the scenes of which monasticism is hardly a prominent part of mainstream spirituality. We all have known how Bishop Kallistos would circulate in Oxford lecturing in his cassock, ever faithful to his bidding of his Hierunda Amphilochius, always to wear his cassock. We took it for granted. And sometimes we may overlook what it cost him. Vladika said to me, "I realized that most of my colleagues considered me rather, if not eccentric, rather peculiar, and in that way I was somewhat set apart. I had indeed many friends in the theology faculty, but I think they considered me a little strange and not very typical. As a monk myself, I do know the reality that lies behind his words and how it feels once you put your monastic habit in the midst of the world. And I believe that through this sacrificial witness, his martyrdom, orthodoxy in general and Orthodox monasticism in particular came to be accepted and respected at the highest level of British society. As a monk who studied at the same university where Vladika lectured, I felt that it was due to his witness that I was not written off as some sort of a loony, but I was accepted as an integral character of student life in Oxford. And the whole army of bearded clergy and monks who have studied under Bishop Kallistos, we all socially flourished in the shining rays of his personality, a personality that has become something of a legend in its own time, but indeed continues to grow massively with time. Also, his inspiring example of spiritual stability as a monk has helped me and many other monks, his students there, to face the challenge over our monastic vocation while we were living away from our monasteries. His monastic martyria also overshadowed his academic career. I remember how his theological message in his lectures would bear an unmistakable stamp of authenticity. He taught patristics at Oxford. Most of the Holy Fathers were monks and bishops. Because of his monastic presence would naturally blend with his theology. He taught us that authentic theology is the one that affects and expresses itself in real life when theoria becomes praxis. How remarkably his monasticism breathes life into his theology, and vice versa. We see it in Vladika. He always lived what he taught and what he professed. It is not surprising that Vladika has had a larger number of students under his supervision than many other contemporary tutors at the university. Now, when I look back at my Oxford years, when Metropolitan Kallistos was and will forever remain my Oxford Yeronda, his guidance by word and by his overwhelming example embraces not only my monastic life, but my life in its totality, my spiritual life, my theology, my church ministry. I think neither words nor any length of time given will ever suffice to express our gratitude to Vladika. So I think from all of us, we can say to Vladika, Tassa ek ton son, thine own of thine own. We offer unto you our everlasting thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Nikolai, and thank you all of our speakers in this session. We have now paid our hagiographical tribute to Metropolitan Kallistos. Tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. sharp, we shall start straight in with the Philokalia. Meanwhile, Compline will be said in this room in a few minutes from now, and after that I hope that the bar will still be open. But can we once again thank this evening's speakers in the usual way?